Welcome to Hustle and Flow with Heather Hubbard, episode number 34. Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard, and I was a litigator, partner, and practice group leader at an NAWL 200 firm. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your personal life. So how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you embrace your ambition without selling your soul? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Welcome back. I am your host, Heather Hubbard. Thank you so much for joining me. I have some really exciting material to share with you today. I just got back from Boston for the National Association of Women Lawyers Meeting the Challenge program. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that I shared back in, I believe it was March, in episode 9, The Numbers Don't Lie. And I shared the report for the 10-year survey related to the NAWL challenge. And if you didn't listen to that, I encourage you to go back. But just briefly, they identified in 2006 what they called the 50-15 conundrum. And that was that women had been graduating from law schools at 50% for over 15 years, and yet there were only 15% equity partners, general counsel. That was about the number. And so they issued a challenge and said to the largest law firms and to the Fortune 1000 companies and said, we want to issue you a challenge that in 10 years, by 2016, we increase these numbers to 30%. We would like to see 30% of women in these roles. I shared with you the really depressing numbers, again, in episode number 9, where 10 years later, we had really missed the mark. And so during that time, last year, NAWL decided to issue a new challenge and said, okay, look, let's do this again, but we're going to actually shorten the time frame because you got to get serious about this. You guys aren't really serious. We want to see 30% by 2020. And I'm saying 30%. Technically, it's a third. But so it's a third by 2020. And we'll get into this a little bit later, because intersectionality is becoming such an important topic. It always has been, but we just now seem to be acknowledging it. There is another part of that challenge, and that is for law firms and companies to increase it's not just women of color, but basically anyone that's in an underrepresented minority category. So that would include LGBT, people with disabilities. In all of those numbers, let's increase the equity partners, let's increase the general counsel roles by 30%. Okay, so it's not let's get it to 30%, but let's increase it by 30%. So this was the first year of reporting from the new challenge that was issued. And I decided to go up to Boston. I was a sponsor. It was so much fun. I was able to see so many familiar faces, wonderful women that I hadn't seen in a while, as well as a lot of new faces. So it was a really fun trip for me. And because I was a sponsor, I got to include some swag in the gift bag. And I may have gotten a little too excited about that, but I had a lot of fun and was able to give some beautiful, I'm just going to tell you about it, some beautiful journals. They were white with gold foil embossed. And anyway, it was a lot of fun. I posted a picture to Instagram, so you can go check it out if you want to see it. Anyway, I'm getting off topic, but I really enjoyed going up there. They gave us a preview of the report. It is now out. So we will link to that in the show notes, but the 2016 survey is now out and you can access it on NAWL.org. So what I want to do today, I want to share some of the numbers. I'm not going to go nearly as in depth as I did in episode number 9, but because I was actually at the program and we had a lot of discussions, panel discussions and discussions, with the audience, we talked about what's working and what's not working. And that's part of what I want to share about today, because I always find that stuff really interesting and it's something that you can take back. The numbers are important, but the actions that we are taking in response to those those numbers. That's really the most important thing and what we really need to be talking about. So let's do the numbers first, and then we will move on to what's working and what's not working and what some people shared that I want you to know about. Okay, so similar to what I shared with you in episode number 9, they're still only getting about half of the firms to report their numbers. And that number keeps decreasing, at least in the recent years. And so although the numbers that I'm going to share with you, some include increases, which is great, we do have to keep in mind that we can only track the statistics that are reported. So it's probably the case that the numbers aren't quite as good as we are sharing today because, it's human tendency not to report what's not going well. If you are a law firm managing partner or you're the person charged with this at your firm and you just choose not to provide your statistics, either that shows that you don't care about this issue at all, even if you say you do, or you don't really want to submit your numbers, right? So that said, I personally think that these numbers are probably higher than is reality. All right. So there has been an increase in equity partners. Again, I think that that's probably not true for a lot of firms, but we went from 16% of female equity partners in 2007. So it's a 10-year look back. And the reporting this year was 19%. So if you're in an AmLaw 200 firm, or any firm for that matter, you can look and say, does my firm have 19% female equity partners? And the answer to that is probably no. So you can just take that with a grain of salt. But it does look like for those reporting, it has increased by 3%. And that's great news, right? Except we're talking about a decade. We really should be making more progress than 3% in a decade. This is going to take us forever to get to 30% unless we start making major movement. One thing interesting that was shared was that for the firms that are on a one-tier system, so to make partner, you're automatically an equity partner. Those are generally longer tracks, but it appears that women tend to do better, both in terms of the number making equity partner and 2, the compensation that they are receiving. So, I know we've moved to that 2-tier system. Most people are doing it, but it looks like women fare better under the 1-tier approach. Okay. But if you look at the firms that have the 2-tier approach, the reporting this year is that 30% of the income partners or the non-equity partners, that's now at 30% for women. The number of counsel and staff attorney roles continues to increase for women. And like I shared in episode 9, if that's what women want, that's great. My fear is that we have basically created a category where we can put women where we think they belong better and now allow basically an excuse, institutionalized discrimination for the men to take the positions in the equity role and now even in the non-equity and income role. Another statistic that I want to share with you, again, this is similar to what was reported before, even though women are reporting more overall hours than men, they're working more, they have much more non-billable hours. So women are only billing 92% that men are. And as we all know, non-billables are not compensated. Firms may say they take it into account, but they don't, if we're being honest. So, that could be an entire episode. In fact, now that I say that, I do have an episode on that. It's called Non-Billable Purgatory. And let me see. That was episode number 27. So I talk a little bit kind of how to get around that, but this tends to be an issue for women. They get admin roles in firms where they're expected to do non-billable work, but they're not compensated for it. So of course, if men are billing more hours and not doing the non-billable piece, and that's the part that is compensated and promoted, then they're going to have higher numbers at the top. Speaking of the numbers of billables, it's also important to look at business development. So again, 97% of the firms reported that their top earner was a man. So only 3% of firms said that their top earner was a woman. Although honestly, this is the state of the world we're in. I was actually surprised and wanted to cheer on that there were even 3% of women, or 3% of firms that had the top earner as a woman. So, and then 70% of firms only have one or no women in their top 10 earners. So again, now, I don't have an episode on this. When we talk about how do you develop business and how you're sharing credit and how that system works in general, men tend to do better. And so I've heard the argument, and it drives me crazy, but I've heard the argument that women they're just not as good at, bringing in business. Well, the cards are stacked. And we're not exactly giving people tools. So one of the conversations that was really interesting to me, and we'll discuss it a little bit later, is firms taking an active role in making sure that the bias is removed when it comes to sharing credits and helping develop business and succession planning, right? The statistics show that if you are a white man, you are more likely to receive a book of business from your mentor than you are if you're a woman or a minority. All right. Pay gap. So, because so many of us are on systems that are lockstep, at least for associates, and at some firms for non-equity partners, you would think that there would not be a pay gap, and yet there is. So it's better than the public overall, but in law firms, women receive 94% of what men do in equity partnership. Interestingly enough, they again were able to track that firms that had really established women's initiatives, they were doing much better than firms that had relatively new ones, as well as the number of women on the comp committee. So that 100% impacts how you fare under your comp system. It's been shown over and over again, the more women you have on the comp committee, the smaller the pay gap between men and women at the firm. And then I thought this was good news. The women in firm governance roles has increased. And I think that is a promising sign. So we now have women in 25% of roles in management. And that includes governance committees, management, like compensation, practice group. So this isn't just committees in general, but the true managing committees, people that are in leadership positions. And that has increased to 25%. I think that is a great sign. That is a pretty good bump compared to where we had been going for 10 years. So at least firms and companies are saying we're at least committed to making that happen. Okay. One last statistic I want to share, and this one in my mind is the most depressing, and that is that women of color are really being overlooked here. So when we talk about women, we're generally talking about white women. Now, you may say, that's not true. That's not true at all. But I question, for example, with your initiative, your women's initiative or your firm, how often are you looking at the data related to women of color? And how often are you looking at the retention and promotion? My guess is, like most firms, like most companies, you have women's initiatives and then you have diversity initiatives. Sometimes they overlap, but for the most part, we're talking about just women, and then we're just talking about people of color. But women of color face unique challenges that are not being discussed because they're not really the highlight of either of those groups. And I was happy to see that throughout the day, there were two different panels on intersectionality. There was a great presentation by a researcher at Harvard, and then there was also a panel with women of color talking about the importance of focusing on intersectionality. And one of the women shared, and I thought this was really interesting. She said, with women, there's generally the question of commitment, right? We assume, how committed is a woman? This has always been her issue. Is she going to have children? And if she has children, is she going to come back? And even if she comes back, she has family obligations. So the bias is that if you're a woman, you're not committed. She said, for people of color, the issue isn't commitment, it's competence. The bias is that you are not competent. The bias is that you went to law school and you got the job based upon some type of handout or affirmative action and that you are not qualified. Well, what if you're a woman of color? Now you're seen as neither committed nor competent. And so it shouldn't shock us that only 2% of our equity partners are women of color. And this same panelist pointed out, and it really stopped me in my tracks. She said, when we talk about numbers, we're like, well, 19% of equity partners are women. And so, it's depressing, but we're like, okay, we're graduating at a rate of 50%, but only 20% more or less are equity partners. Well, what if you look at the numbers for women of color? If that was the case for all women, if only 2% of equity partners were women, we would be outraged. We would be outraged. But because we don't ever break it down and because we don't really look at those numbers, we just say, oh, I'm committed. I'm an educated, progressive woman. Of course, I'm committed to diversity and to women of color. But if you're never looking at those numbers and if you are not outraged, then you're not really helping the cause. And she's right. That is an outrageous number. And you can't say, oh, well, there's just not as many women of color graduating from law school. The truth is women of color are now at 60% of law school graduates for just people of color in general. And so although there's not great statistics, because again, they're in two different groups and people generally don't look at them in their own category, it's about 15%. So somewhere between 15 and 20% of law school graduates are women of color. And they only have 2% of representation in equity partnership. So this is something that we need to continue to focus on. And I encourage you, if you have a women's initiative, if you are part of a women's organization, if you are not looking at these numbers, if you are not talking about this every single time you meet, then we are doing a disfavor to the women of color that also need to have a voice, and we need to be paying attention to what's happening. Because even though firms are having more women of color come in as the associate level, it's actually going down for Black women. And so we have to be committed to paying attention to that and having the conversation. Okay, so let's move on to some of the discussions that were being had in the room. And I think these are really interesting. You can kind of check it with what's going on at your firm, and hopefully you'll get some ideas as to what you can take back. All right, so there are really two issues here. There's both retention and there's promotion. Now, the stats that I shared with you from this NAWL report, it all relates to promotion. But as we know, if you don't have a pipeline, it's hard to promote. So we got to talk about retention first and foremost, and that's what we did in the room. Okay, so we raised hands. We tried to do a poll electronically. It didn't work. So then we just started raising hands and talking. And everyone seemed to identify that there were two markers where firms were losing the most women. And there was a third marker, but it was not as common, but I'm going to share it as well. So what we found, and it's certainly my experience in working with firms, that most firms are losing women at the 5-year mark and the 10-year mark, 5 years and 10 years. And so there was a lot of discussion about, why is that? And at the 5-year mark, there was the question of, well, is that when women start to have children? And the report back was, actually, it's generally before they do. And then at the 10-year mark, women generally have children by then. And so there was this discussion of, is it the children? Now, episode number 4. I talk about this. I tell you my feelings about it. Episode number 4, it's called Don't Blame It on the Kids. And by the way, I'm talking to firms and companies, not parents. I genuinely, based on, everyone I talk to, everyone I work with, I don't see that as the major issue. And it was interesting for me to see and hear that the rest of the room felt the same way. So here's what they were finding out, because they're doing not just exit interviews, but the women's initiatives are starting to do their own exit interviews. And so if you're not doing that, I highly encourage you to do so. I think I actually shared in episode number 4 that I was doing at my firm my own exit interviews. They were not necessarily approved. They were just, my own exit interviews with women that were leaving. So here were the reasons that were given. The women in the room, by the way, they were either the diversity professionals, women on their women's initiatives leading these. So they're very involved. They know what's going on in their firms. And they said that the reasons women were leaving at these marks, 1, a lack of innovation. So because firms are stuck on this archaic billable model that does not value or promote efficiency or any kind of innovation, that because women were more likely to be efficient and care about that and want to be more innovative and do things in a better way so that they don't have to be at the office all the time while still making the same amount of money for the firms aren't open to that. So that's one of the reasons women are leaving, because it's just not a good business model and they get frustrated with it and walk away because they think that there's a better way to do it. Another common reason, not getting the work and clients that they want. So they're just not getting to work on the really good, juicy matters. And they feel more like they're being, admin. They're taking notes. They're not getting opportunities to speak. And that can be, really deflating. And so that's why women were leaving. And then this feeling of failing, just this feeling of not being able to succeed at anything. They're failing at home. They're failing with their family and friends. They're failing at the firm because they see, their male counterparts passing them by. They're not being able to build their books of business. And so it's just this sense that, you've always been this high achieving woman and suddenly you feel as if you're failing. And who wants to live like that? So they then exit out. And I just wanted to share that with you, that that's what the room said. It really was not because of children. It really wasn't because of work-life balance. It was more about, this isn't working for me and I'm not going to continue to bang my head against the wall. I'm leaving. And so, I really hope firms will start to listen to this and recognize that if they want to make a difference, if they want to retain and promote women, they have to get focused on making sure that they get great opportunities and they're treated equally. We had a wonderful presentation by Dr. Paola Cecchi Demeglio. She is the chair of the Executive Leadership Research Initiative for Women and Minority Attorneys at Harvard Law School. I had to read that. That was a mouthful. She is doing some amazing work. Oh my goodness. I was so excited to hear about what she's doing. So her theory is you're not ever going to be able to convince people that they have a bias. You're not ever going to be able to convince people that they should stop being biased. Instead, you just have to change the structure so that it takes the bias out. And she calls this nudging. And so she's been doing some research with some really large firms and getting great results. So for example, she said that one of the things they have found, and this has been proven in a few different studies, and that is that performance reviews, women are not seen as being able to do as good a job of men, and people of color definitely are not seen as being able to do as good of a job as white people. So how do you handle that? She starts to do these studies and ask these questions about, how inclusive is your firm? How inclusive are you? Do you support women? Do you support people of color? And, the answer is always yes, of course. But then when you actually start pulling data like, okay, well, how many women do you work with and what role are they playing on your team? And what's their bonuses or comp compared to the men on your team? How often are you meeting with them outside of work or giving them true mentoring compared to the men? How many friends do you have that you're hanging out with outside of work that are women or people of color? And then when you show the results, it's like, oh, wow, so maybe I'm not as inclusive as I thought. And that's true for women too, by the way. We white women tend to think, we support women of color, but how often are you hanging out with women of color? How many are your friends, right? So sometimes you think you're one way, but when you see the data, you're like, oh, maybe I'm not really doing what I thought. I'm talking the talk, but I'm not walking the walk, and I had no idea. So that's one thing. But another is she's actually changing these performance reviews so that the firm says, well, here's what's important to us. And then they start measuring it on a daily basis, which I know sounds crazy. She even said it sounds crazy. The firm didn't want to do it. But now that they have been doing it, turns out they were able to remove the bias because women are now getting much better performance reviews than men. Not better, but it's equal. It's not skewed. So when you ask people to review people at the end of the year, and you just say, okay, tell me about this associate. Tell me about this associate. and they're just trying to remember overall how someone is doing, bias comes in. But when you look at what they're doing on a daily basis, turns out women are performing just as well as men. And so that has been helping. She's doing a lot of other research as well. We don't have time to get into it all because I am running out of time, but I thought it was really interesting. You can go to the Harvard website to get more information on that. Okay, quickly, the other group that a few firms said they were struggling with was women that are at the retirement age. They're exiting out sooner than the men. So that's an interesting trend. All right. So number 2, the second issue is promotion, right? And there are a few things being done that are really interesting. One is the Mansfield rule, and it started with 30 firms. There are now, I think, close to 40 or 45, and that comes out of the diversity lab. And basically it's saying, okay, it's the same concept as the Rooney rule from the NFL. So Mansfield was the first female attorney. And so it's this Mansfield rule, and it was like, okay, if you're going to consider any kind of promotion at a leadership level, so equity partners, management, you agree that your slate of candidates will be at least 30% women or people of color. And it's not just that. I mean, I always struggle with, a lot of people don't like the word diversity, but oftentimes we're talking about underrepresented partners. And when we talk about religion or LGBT or disabilities, anything like that where we know there's discrimination going on, that's included as well. So for even if you don't like the word diversity, that's what I'm using just because I think it better captures what we're looking at here. So with the Mansfield rule, we're going to have 30% diverse candidates being considered for the position. And so I think that is a great concept. I'm so glad that firms are saying we are willing to pilot this program and try it out. And it will make a difference. I know it will. But there's then also the issue of it's one thing to be considered, and I'm using air quotes there. It's another to actually get the job. And, one of the things that I commonly hear from firms is, well, we don't have enough qualified people, right? So that goes back to retention and bias in considering whether or not someone is qualified or can do just as good of a job. So the Mansfield rule is great. I can't wait to see where that goes. But hopefully firms will commit to actually giving people resources to succeed. One firm shared, and I thought this was a wonderful idea. One firm shared that they were doing, and it's informal in the sense that there's not a big announcement or program or anything like that, but it's just the management. It's the diversity director working with the executive management team to say, we need to make sure that our diverse equity partners are matched up with the biggest rainmakers in our firm for not just mentoring, but business development mentoring. And I had not heard of that concept before, and I think it's great. She said that they have seen a difference, that the people that are participating in that, they are increasing their book of business. And that's exactly what we want to hear. That's exactly what we want to see, is basically someone saying, okay, I get that you made it this far, but how are we going to make sure you truly succeed? And so I may naturally not mentor you or help you to develop your business, but because I have agreed, perhaps through the pressure of the executive management, to make sure that I'm working with you on a regular basis and I'm working with you closely to develop your own plan and make sure that you are growing your book. So I think that's a great idea. If your firm isn't doing something like that, I encourage you to consider it. Another firm shared that they're getting very involved in succession planning. So a lot of firms say that, we got to work on succession planning, but they don't say, how are we looking at succession planning and diversity? So it's hard enough to get an attorney to have a succession plan. It's even harder to make sure that that succession plan includes women and minorities. The statistics show that if there is a plan, it's likely going to a white man. And so if there's naturally a bias there, you got to talk through that. So one firm is getting really proactive about going and having conversations. One where they see someone is working with women or they're working with a minority partner and they're not sharing credit, going to them and having conversations about it, which is huge, right? I mean, it has to be a top-down approach. So if you have executive managers and leaders going and having these conversations about why are you not sharing credit, that's important. And then also going for the people that are nearing retirement to say, let's talk about your succession plan and let's talk about how we can make sure we're including diverse attorneys in that. Can we give it to a woman? Can we give it to a minority? Or can we split it up at the very least? So I thought that was another really good approach. Another firm, they said that for them, it's really about training. And so their women's initiative, their diversity initiative is less about just having conversations and meetings, but actually overseeing. They're the ones tracking the numbers. They're looking at the numbers. They're reporting to the executive committee. They are making sure that people have the support they need. They're getting them the training that they need. And I think that is wonderful and super important. And, you may not know this, so I just want to briefly mention it. One of the things that I do, because I'm really just dedicated to the promotion of women and minorities in law, I have diversity partner masterminds. And that's where it's really the concept of, okay, you've got the Mansfield rule, but how are you then going to make sure you've got people, ready to go? And the diversity partner mastermind says, okay, you've invested a ton of money in wonderful attorneys. Statistics show they're going to leave the firm. Either you're going to push them out or they're going to leave on their own accord because they're not hitting your numbers or they get really frustrated. So it's saying, okay, how do we help you build your book of business? How do we help you get into leadership roles? How do we say, what do you want? What do you want your career to look like? Because oftentimes there's not someone you can look to within your firm to say, yeah, I want that. So it's like, okay, what do you want and how do we make that happen? So I work with AmLaw 200 firms on that. You can get information on my website. If you just go to heatherjoyhubbard.com, go to firms and look at the diversity masterminds. It kind of outlines what we do in those programs, what you would need to do in order to qualify for it. But the idea is just that you continuing to provide the training and the information that people need in order to succeed within your firm. So that is something I am passionate about. Okay, I've gone really long, but it's a topic that's important to me. I'm going to leave you with one last takeaway that one of the women shared that was speaking. And she said, you can't wait for power to be given to you. You have to take it. I encourage you to take some of these ideas back to your firms. Take the power. And let's all be committed to helping each other, especially women of color. And let's meet this challenge of 30% by 2020. For show notes, downloads, and other free resources, and to keep the conversation going, head on over to hustleandflowpodcast.com. See you there.